The forgotten, the Watchtower last night. I forgot the Watchtower last night, which is the only way any of this began, with a small, mortifying absence that pricked at the edges of my sleep. I woke with the idea lodged under my tongue, an image of stone and salt, and a window like an eye, but had no name to pin to it. By morning, the certainty had thinned, a film over a photograph, and the town moved as if the empty space had always been empty. That forgetting felt like a stain I could still smell: iodine, old paper, and something metallic. The town had been smaller since my childhood. Shops shuttered, lamplights spaced further apart, but its bones stayed the same: narrow alleys, church bell that liked to forget the hour, and a ridge that fell toward a marsh the maps called low tide. Locals spoke in careful sentences about tides and fences, never about towers. When I asked after the ridge, a woman at the grocer's fumbled for a name and found blankness. Her mouth formed polite words that carried no memory with them. My house waited with the patience of old things. The key I found under a chipped pot fit the lock, as if it had been waiting in its hole for my thumb. In the back drawer of a kitchen, I barely remembered, beneath a moth-eaten scarf, there lay a brass pocket watch. It was my grandfather's, or at least everyone had once said so. It was heavy with a weight that felt like lineage. The face was smudged, the glass not quite whole, and it ticked in a rhythm that made my pulse feel clumsy and new. That night, the watch did something small and wrong. It skipped an hour, and then, annoying me, ticked back against the flow. I lay awake listening to its breath, translating ticks into heartbeats, inventing meanings. In the drawer beneath the watch, I found a leather-bound book, keeper's logbook, its pages salt-stiff. Names crowded the margins, hands cramped and slanted, entries like signatures on a contract none of them wanted to sign. Each entry ended with the same clipped phrase that felt less like a note and more like an invocation. Irene Keller came by the next morning with bread and a look like a bent twig. She'd kept the lane beside my house from the world for as long as anyone remembered, and her memory had the stubbornness of dried roots. When I asked about the tower, she frowned and said, "Towers don't like being remembered." She laughed, a little too high, then apologized and muttered that the old ridge was only a rumor kids tell on late nights. Her eyes slid past me when she said it, as if she were checking for someone else. Curiosity has a particular gravity. I walked the marsh path at dusk, slipping along the mud where footprints caved and held like small graves. The path stretched and contracted as though someone were moving the horizon with invisible hands. The lamplight seemed to hesitate between trees and then decide it preferred the reeds. The tower was there, at the crest of the ridge, squat and blank-eyed, a thing that did not announce itself so much as reveal the absence of other things. The door was unlocked. Inside, the tower smelled of salt and old paper, of rain settled into stone. Stairs wound like thought in slow stages, and as I climbed the air grew cooler and the light thinner, as if the building filtered the day. Scratched into the banister were initials and dates, some recent, some almost lost to time. When I reached the lantern room, I thought I would find glass and brass and nothing more. But there was a table, a lamp that did not need oil, and maps pinned up with red thread stretching from points that mattered to points that didn't. On the table, the clock face lay like a pale palm, its hands frozen. The maps had marks I recognized from childhood hikes, but they also showed phantom roads and a blank where the town should snug itself. The keeper's logbook sat open, its entries more frantic the higher the pages I turned. Names bled into one another, repeated phrases about forgetting and about the space left in place of it. The last entry was written in a hurried hand with ink that smelled faintly of the sea and of someone who'd been trying to anchor themselves to a rope of words. There was a cadence in the tower, as if the building had a pulse. Small shifts of air, a distant tap like a watch winding itself. At first I told myself it was the sea or the settling of old stones, but the taps came in rhythms that matched the watch in my pocket. I held the watch to my ear, and it answered like a shy animal, its ticks crossing into a frequency that made the lantern light seem to breathe. For a moment, I thought the tower and the watch were talking to one another, and that thought took on the shape of a question I couldn't find the words to ask. The logbook's entries ran like a chain. Forgot again. The lens makes it small. We misnamed the shore, each line followed by dates that looped and then skipped. There were names I could place keepers and their kin, then pages that read like a chorus of different hands trying to say the same thing. One page held the same sentence written many times until the ink wore thin. Remember the stone. Remember to remember. That repetition felt less like instruction and more like a spell read aloud into a room that had ears. I realized then that forgetting wasn't passive here, it propagated. A neighbor's name missing from a placard, a photograph where a square of wall was oddly blank, things that used to anchor people were vanishing without explanation. When I asked about old photographs, someone held up an album and frowned. The edges were there, faces blurred, and in the center, a hole where a building should be. I felt ridiculous, colonized by a doubt so small it might have been imagined, until the radio in my bag clicked and a voice said, "We don't know why it isn't there." The radio was supposed to be comfort, a way to call out into a world and have it answer. Instead, the voice on the other end half remembered, speaking in halting sentences, as if someone had tried to translate a dream into fact. Irene's voice came and then dissolved. She could name our street, but not the ridge, could remember my father's laugh, but not a stone that once kept watch. Each consultation seemed to shave a little more detail from the tower, until memory itself had the shape of a leak. At the parapet, I saw the figure for the first time, a silhouette leaning against the low wall, watching the sea in a way that suggested someone waiting for something that might arrive only in another year. From a distance, it could have been any keeper, but there was a familiarity to the posture that tightened my throat. When I climbed up, the figure did not turn. Instead, it seemed to dissolve at the edges, as if painted over by gray paint. My reflection in the lantern glass looked thinner than the person who had come in. I found, taped beneath the table, a page torn from a map with a notation in a hurried hand. If you read this, write it down elsewhere. Leave a trace. My fingers trembled as I scrawled what I could: names, the shape of the ridge, descriptions that felt clumsy and insufficient. I left the logbook a new line, careful and deliberate, a small stake to pin memory to. For a night it worked. The townspeople paused when I mentioned the ridge, and some reached into old drawers to pull out envelopes and photographs, as if my words pressed them into remembering. The relief was brittle. By morning, a shopkeeper could not recall why he had reached for an envelope. An old friend told me they'd never seen a tower there, though their hands shook a little as they helped me carry an old lens. I found photographs again, this time with the tower faintly visible in the margins like an afterimage, only to return an hour later and find the ghosts smudged beyond recognition. The memory I had strung like beads grew heavier and more conspicuous, and I felt watched not by eyes, but by the sense of being the last to keep score. I began to dream of sitting at the tower's table with other hands keepers gone, or not yet arrived, each writing their names down as if on a roll call for the lost. In those dreams, the ink bled upward, letters dissolving like tidewater, and a voice that might have been the sea told me that forgetting is a kind of keeping. When things leave, they make a pocket in which memories can be folded and kept safe, except sometimes the pocket closes and you can no longer find the seam. I woke with brine in my throat and the taste of a word I couldn't carry. There's a choice in being the last remembered, to keep a thing by naming it, or to let it go and ease whatever wants to be forgotten. I sat at the lantern table and wrote until my hands cramped, the pen moving with the stubbornness of someone making a bargain. I wrote names, places, even the small things, a dent in the banister, the scent of mothballs in the logbook, and I left the page open to dry. When I looked back an hour later, the ink was paler, as if the tower itself had been tidying up after me. I walked back down the path at dawn, carrying the logbook like contraband. The town opened around me like a face trying to remember a name. People looked at me with the polite blankness of those who have been asked an impossible question. At the corner where the ridge met the road, there was a child skipping, and for a sliver of a moment, she looked at me as if the tower were the most natural thing in the world. Then she looked away and laughed, and the laugh sounded like someone folding a map. I kept walking, because sometimes remembering is an unbearable thing to share. At my kitchen table, I left the last page of my entry open and sat with the watch in my palm. The brass warmed under my skin, and the ticks grew irregular again, then steadied. I thought of the tower, a wound in the map that some people refused to look at, and I thought of the choice to remember or release. I did not know whether by keeping a record I was saving something or letting something loose. Outside, the tide moved with a patient indifference, and the town continued its small, polite forgetting, as if it were the weather. Some nights since, when the fog comes low and the lamp gutters, I wake and find the logbook's last line lighter than I remember. The town smooths itself between one evening and the next, and sometimes I pass a shop and feel a space where memory should be, like a missing tile on a familiar floor. I keep writing, setting small anchors in ink, and each time I leave a mark, something in the stone answers with a faint, patient shift. Whether the tower is a wound or a cure is a question that folds inside me. And for now, the watch keeps its slow, deliberate secrets,